Okay, let's begin with the introduction to Chapter 3. So in this chapter, we're going to talk about economic institutions. And remember, we've defined economic institutions as those formal and informal rules that we use to organize our economic activity. So what are our goals for this chapter? One, we need to define a market economy, and we want to compare and contrast a few different of the what we call the isms, so different economic systems. So we're going to have a little bit of comparative systems. Describe how business, households, and government interact in a market economy. Summarize briefly the advantages and disadvantages of various businesses. And by that we mean business types. And explain why, even though households have ultimate power, much of economic decision-making is done by businesses and government. All right, state 6 roles of government and explain why global policy issues differ from national policy issues. Well, we'll talk a little bit about that. Okay, the U.S. economy in historical perspective. So the first thing is that the U.S. economy is a market economy. Well, more accurate it would be to say a U.S. economy is a mixed market economy. The U.S. economy contains both elements of a market commodity or economy and a planned economy, something with interaction between regulators and the market. So a market economy is an economy in which private property and markets, in which in principle individuals decide how, what, and for whom to produce. So through a market system, all right, we come together, you decide how much you want to buy, how much you want to pay for it, I decide how much I want to sell, how much I want to take for it, and the interaction of those buyers and sellers helps us make this decision of how much to produce, what to produce, and who gets the production. That's in essence a market economy. In a pure market economy, there would be nothing but a market. So the market would run everything. Well, in our system, we don't have a pure market economy. We have a mixed market economy because we realize, and in fact economists all the way back to Adam Smith, who is considered to be one of the first real economists, have realized that a pure market economy doesn't work for everything. There are some goods that just don't work well in a market, but most do. So markets work through a system of rewards and payments. So we basically have this incentive. Why do I want to produce soybeans if I'm a soybean farmer? Well, simple. Because somebody buys my soybeans, and from them buying my soybeans, I earn income. All right. I have to have that income in order to live, and I'm not exactly just creating soybeans for the heck of creating soybeans. Now, you say, well, but sometimes I do create things just for the heck of it, right? Like, for example, I might have a garden, and I have no intention of selling them in any kind of market. Well, actually, yeah, you do. A market with yourself. You provide labor, and for that labor, you get, say, fresh-grown tomatoes. Individuals are free to do whatever they want as long as it's legal. All right, now we're getting into a little bit more of the mixed market setup. We do have regulation. For example, a market that we frown upon is the market for hitmen. All right, or hit people. In other words, I cannot hire someone to kill somebody else for me. Right? That's illegal. Right? We don't like that. Well, in a pure market system, we wouldn't have that restriction. You'd have a little bidding war go on. So, I'd hire the assassin. The assassin would go over to the guy who I hire, and he says, this guy just paid me $500 to shoot you. If you give me $1,000, I'll go shoot him. And we go back and forth and bid, and whoever's the highest bidder is the one that gets, or whoever's not the highest bidder is the one who gets shot. Fluctuations in prices play a central role in coordinating individuals' wants in a market economy. Yeah, so price tells us a lot of information about the good. It gives us really great insight into the relative values of different goods. And it helps us ration those goods. So I have a Jeep Liberty, right? That's about 5 years old. Actually, it's about 6 years old. All right. What I would like to have is a brand new Tesla Roadster. All right, but So the brand new Tesla Roadster costs like $200,000, and well, I can't afford $200,000, and so I continue to drive my 6-year-old Jeep, which I like quite well. That's a method of price rationing out where these products go and figuring out, okay, well, how much do I value a car? Now, at some point, I might decide to spend $200,000 on a house, but, it's just never going to happen for me on a car. Most economists believe the market is a good way to coordinate economic activity, for the most part. All right, for most goods, most day-to-day interactions, the market works better than anything else we've come up with. There are a few exceptions, but mostly it works pretty good. Capitalism. So this is the first ism. This is the one we're most familiar with because we basically live in a fairly close to capitalist society. Capitalism is an economic system based on a market in which ownership of the means of production resides with a small group of individuals called capitalists. And that's, okay, we have to define what we call a small group of individuals. Probably an easier way to define capitalism is how wealth is distributed. All right? In capitalism, wealth is distributed based on contribution to production. You say, well, what the heck does that mean? Well, that means that if you work really hard and thus produce a lot, you will be rewarded for that with high income. But on the other hand, if you own lots of capital, so lots of stuff, factories and businesses and all this stuff that makes lots of stuff, then you will also be rewarded with high income. All right, so this capitalism is really based on this distribution of wealth based on ownership of means of production, or not necessarily ownership of means of production, although that's pretty much it. It's contribution to production. Socialism, on the other hand, is an economic system based on, this is just a bad definition, because there's really two. We can break socialism down into two basic parts, or two different types. There's a command socialism, so like what we saw in the old Soviet Union, what we saw in China before the economic reforms really began. So if we go back about 25, 30 years ago, we would see this kind of command socialism in economies like the old Soviet Union, the old East Germany, or China. All right, and that's really a centrally planned system where the amounts, the decision of what, how much, and for whom stuff is produced is really determined by some central planner somewhere. On the other hand, there's market socialism. And you probably don't remember this, but the old Yugoslavia, all right, before it broke up and went into civil war, the old Yugoslavia operated under a market socialism system. So their means of production were actually owned by the public or the government, but they all operated within a market system. So there's two very, very different types of socialism. In fact, we have a lot of socialism in the United States. There's a lot of goods that we might call social goods, or we might even better term for it would be public goods. All right, that's actually the actual term for it, is public goods that really need to be provided by a government because they can't be provided by individuals. For example, a road system. It's very difficult for private enterprise to provide something big and indivisible like a road system. National defense is another example. But socialism, we can define it by how goods or wealth is distributed. Wealth is distributed in socialism by work, by how much you work. So the main difference between those two is within socialism, just owning capital or owning land is not going to be enough to earn you high income. You actually have to do good, high-quality work. Socialism is where all people contribute what they can and get what they need. Actually, that's closer to a pure form of communism than it is socialism. Socialism in the kind of economic progression that Karl Marx who you might know from the Communist Manifesto, envisioned as an intermediate step towards this communism, where you can define pure communism as this from each according to his ability to each according to his need. That has never existed on Earth. No country has ever achieved a communist type society. The closest you might see to that might be within a family unit. And within a family unit, you wouldn't even call that communism. You'd call it more a communal system. It is based on government ownership and means of production, with economic activities centrally planned in a command socialism setting. Within a market socialism, it may not be centrally planned. So China and Venezuela are often identified as socialist in the news. China has been rapidly moving away from that towards a more capitalist system. People talk today about the differences in economic systems, and comparative economic systems really isn't as big a deal today as it used to be. Back before the fall of the Soviet Union, it was actually a fairly interesting topic that got a bit of research done on it. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the topic pretty much died. So there's really no continuing academic research being done in this area to speak of. And we talk about it a little bit, but not a whole lot. Instead, we focus on differences in institutions. And the reason for that is that the economic system isn't nearly as important as the institutions. And what do I mean by that? Well, it's not nearly as important whether we have capitalism or socialism as if we have good, strong property rights, good, strong contract law, good, strong court system that can enforce the law, security. So we need to be able to get our goods from point A to point B without having armed guards to guard it. Good roads to get it from point A to point B. One of the biggest inhibitors to growth in Africa, and sub-Saharan Africa in particular, is a road system. It's very difficult to get stuff from point A to point B in Africa. That's something we've been quite blessed with in the interstate road system that basically spans the continent in the U.S., which is really a major driver of growth in the U.S. So these systems evolve over time. So an economy it's an evolving system. So let's take a look at kind of the history of European economic systems. And we're going to kind of start the Dark Ages and move just a little beyond the Dark Ages into what we call feudalism. Feudalism basically was basic old-time knights and kings and all this. You had what was called a manor, and that manor was completely self-contained. There wasn't a lot of trade between manors, all right, and the manor was owned by a lord, or at least was run by the lord. Maybe the king gave him that manor. And there were different classes of people. The lord had knights, and he used the knights to provide security for his serfs. The serfs actually were, they weren't quite slaves. They were more akin to like trees on your property. So they were owned. They were property. They belonged to the land. In some respects, I think they were almost a step below slaves. But basically, they had to do their part in providing resources for the Lord and resources for the army so that they would get the security and be able to do it their stuff. That was feudalism. But then along came a pretty important event in economic history called the Crusades. And during the Crusades, large armies had to travel. Well, if you have to travel, especially back in that time, you had to have some place to buy supplies along the way. You couldn't carry enough supplies to take you throughout the whole trip. And so these cities developed along the crusade routes to trade with the traveling armies. And with that trade created a merchant class. So we started to develop a merchant class or a middle class. All right? And that development of this middle class helps push us from this feudalism into a system called mercantilism. Now, mercantilism was a system where you had very, very tight control over economic activity. And the basic idea was this. The question was, how does a country become rich? Well, their answer was this. Collect as much gold as you possibly can. So a country was rich, a king was rich, or a queen was rich if that person had a lot of gold in their treasury. Okay, how do I get a lot of gold in my treasury? I export lots and lots of stuff, import very, very little, and take the difference, payment for the difference in gold. And that's what happened. And, well, this created a lot of protectionist policies. In fact, some of these policies spilled over and maybe were some motivation behind the American Revolution. And essentially, it just didn't do a very good job of fostering growth, of really creating wealth. Then along comes another very important event. Adam Smith, in 1776, publishes The Wealth of Nations. And actually, the full title was An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. And in that book, which is kind of considered to be the first true economic text, he really called into question the wisdom of mercantilism. He called into question this and said, hey, look, government, you don't have to do all that stuff. If you just let society alone, let the market alone, it'll figure it out, and it'll do a better job than you are. And you have to remember, he's reacting to essentially a system where the government is highly involved in the economy and doing a really crappy job of it. So they're really doing a lousy job of managing the economy, and he's just saying, hey, wait, don't do that. Just leave it alone. It'll run itself better than you're running it. So that happens. And then along around the same time, we start to have the Industrial Revolution. And what happens is we start moving from cottage industry, where we have craftsmen and artisans making one thing at a time, to factories making lots of things at a time. So we have an explosion in technology, and we start to have a change, a fundamental change in this economic system. All right, the system that Adam Smith proposes is essentially the limited capitalism we have today. All of that comes together to get a capitalist society. So, if you're further interested about this, there's a bit of further reading.